بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. To continue inshallah with إسعاف المريدين لإقامة فرائض الدين by الشيخ عبد الغني الغنيمي الميداني رحمه الله تعالى ورضي عنه. And we previously stopped at the integrals of the tayamum, dry ablution. So we discussed the furud al-wudu and the furud of al-ghusl, and we briefly mentioned al-hadath al-akbar and al-hadath al-asghar. And prior to going on to the furud of the tayammum, the integrals of dry ablution, just to discuss the issue of water. So the author, he does give some indication, although we did not take it. He mentions when discussing the issue of that which breaks the wudu, or that which makes it a necessity for someone to purify themselves of the ritual impurity. He says, وَطَهَارَتُهُ بالوضوء بالماء المطلق عند وجوده والتيمم عند فقده. So, and likewise we can add to that الغسل بالماء المطلق. So he says that a person, when they want to perform wudu, they need to use ma' mutlaq, so water which is basically pure and uncontaminated. And what he is referring to here, al-ma' al-mutlaq, he's saying that the type of water which has not been defined by the addition of an extra name which indicates that which it has been defined by. So for example, if we would say rose water, it is no longer pure water because it has been defined by the fact that the essence of rose has been added to it, and that essence has contaminated it. Even though it's pure, it's contaminated it to the extent that it has been influenced by the qualities of the rose essence. So anything which has been influenced by the qualities of another pure substance, it is not permissible to use for wudu or ghusl, although a person can use that type of water for cleaning the clothing, cleaning the place of prayer, and so on and so forth. And when, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, if we do have the opportunity to go into a more detailed book, this matter is discussed in more detail. To us, it's not very relevant. It is relevant in certain circumstances because we have running, flowing water for us that live in places which are made up, cities and villages and towns, etc., which have modern plumbing systems and so on and so forth. So for us, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have running, flowing water which is accessible most of the time, and so we do not need to worry about contamination with pure substances and so on and so forth. But just a few decades ago for some and a few centuries ago for others, water was not found in such a state. We had to go and fetch water, and we had to be wary of where we store water and its contamination and so on and so forth. So as I mentioned, this will be taken in more detail in a more detailed book, bi'idhnillah. So to continue, he says وَفُرُوضُ التَّيَمُّمْ النِّيَّةِ. So he's going to now outline the integrals of a tayammum. وَمَسْحُ الْوَجْهِ وَالذِّرَاعَيْنِ بِالتُّرَابِ أَوْ مَا هُوَ مِنْ جِنْسِهِ كَالْحَجَرِ وَالرَّمْلِ وَنَحْوِهِمَا. So now he gives basically the parts of tayammum that if they were to be missed, the tayammum would not be valid. So the first thing he says, an-niyya, intention. And in tayammum, the intention is compulsory. Why? Because it is being performed, the dry ablution, with that which in its essence is a mulawith. It's something which soils. If a person were to rub dirt or earth onto their clothing, it would soil the clothing. Whereas with water, water is pure and it purifies in and of itself. Therefore, to use water to purify, you do not need an intention. If I wanted to purify a cup, I do not need to intend to purify the cup with the water. I simply use the water and the water purifies in and of itself. Likewise, if I want to purify my body, when I use the water, it purifies, it cleanses. So I do not need to have an intention. Whereas with the earth, the fact that it is a mulawith, it's something which soils that which it touches, it requires an intention to make it a purifier. That's number one. Number two, the Ahnaf, As-Sadatul Ahnaf, they mention that the fact that it is a condition, i.e. the wudu for the salah, it does not require an intention, just as the other conditions do not require an intention. So for example, facing the qibla, you do not have to have the intention for facing the qibla to be valid for your salah. Likewise, in your wudu, you do not need to have the intention to perform the wudu in order for your wudu to be purifying. If you want your wudu to be an act of ibadah, i.e. you receive reward for it, then yes, you have to have the intention. That's where the ahadith which relate to the intention of wudu come in according to the madhab. And the other issue is the linguistical aspect. At-tayammum, literally in the Arabic language, means qasd. It means to intend. فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says when discussing the issue, or when referring to, I should say, the issue of at-tayammum. So seek out pure earth, or that which is pure and has risen to the surface of the earth. Whereas in the tahara, the niyyah is not it's not mentioned explicitly in the ayah, and the issue of the intention is the same in the issue of ghusl. So with the ghusl, you do not need to have the intention for the ghusl to provide its function of purifying the body and so on and so forth. Then he says, وَمَسْحُ الْوَجْهِ, so wiping of the face, so wiping the entire face with the earth that has been struck. And we'll come to that inshallah in more detail shortly. وَالذِّرَاعَيْنِ بِالتُّرَابِ, likewise the forearms from the fingertips, so from the fingertips to the forearms, all of it should be wiped and encompassed in the person's performance of the dry ablution. And he says, أَوْ مَا هُوَ مِنْ جِنْسِهِ كالحجر والرمل ونحوهما. So what is it that we can use to perform dry ablution? When we perform our tayammum, we can use earth, or he says كالتراب أو الرمل, or sand, أو نحوهما, or anything which basically comes from the earth. It's natural, it comes from the earth, or it's considered to be from that which layers the top part of the earth, and it's pure, it is unused, it has not been, for example, used as clay or anything of the sort, like i.e. burnt or cooked, etc. Then he says, بِجَمِيعِ الْيَدِ أَوْ أَكْثَرِهَا, using the entire hand or most of that which makes up the hand. بِضَرْبَتَيْن, 2 strikes. So 1 strike for the face, and then another strike for the hands and the forearms. So that would be, for example, you'd use the left hand for the right and the right hand for the left. And when you strike for the face, use the 2 hands and the entire face, that which you would use or cover when you are performing your wudu. أو ما يقوم مقامهما, or a person can use that which would take the place of the 2 hands. So for example, someone else performing the tayammum for you, or there are other instances which again are not too relevant to us. Then he says, وَشَرْطُ صِحَّتِهِ وُجُودُ الْعُذْرِ الْمُبِيحِ لَهُ. So now, what are the conditions for its validity? The first and the most important is the presence of that which would be considered a shar'i excuse. So that which would make your tayammum valid, i.e. and he's going to give mention of كَبُعْدِهِ مِيلًا عَنِ الْمَاءِ وَلَوْ فِي الْمِصْرِ. So he says, for example, being 1 mile away from water, roughly, even if you are a city dweller, even if you're in the city, the fact that you are a mile away from the water, that is a valid excuse, i.e. there is no water in the vicinity of your presence, and you need to perform the salah, but the water is a mile away. You know that if you were to travel more than a mile, you would find water. That gives you the excuse of performing tayammum. Then he says, وَبَرْدٍ يَخَافُ مِنْهُ التَّلَفِ. Likewise, extreme weather, extreme coldness, so much so that a person fears if they were to use this water, they would perhaps perish. Then he says, أو المرض, or he is fearful of becoming sick because of the water. And we can add to this, if a person fears he's sick and he fears that using the water is going to increase his sickness, or it's going to delay his cure, his relief from the sickness. In that instance, a person would be able to use tayammum as well. He says, وَخَوْفِ عَدُوٍ وَعَطَشٍ وَاحْتِيَاجٍ لِعَجْنٍ وَطَبْخٍ غَيْرَ مَرَقٍ. So he says, fear of an enemy. And the enemy here can be it can be another person, it could be an animal. For example, if a person were in an area where there is some sort of animal that would attack him if he were to try to go out to acquire water, or he's in a place where there is a battle taking place, or there's some sort of fight taking place, and they know that if they were to go to try to fetch water, or they feared at least if they were to try to acquire water, they would be attacked, they can use the tayammum. And of course, it's not too relevant to the average person. وَاحْتِيَاجٍ لِعَجْنٍ, وعطش. Likewise, if he fears, if he's traveling, for example, and he has a small amount of water, and he fears that if he were to use this water for his wudhu, his purification, he would go thirsty, and he's not sure where he will be able to acquire his next amount of water from, then he can perform tayammum and save the water for his thirst, i.e. for quenching the thirst and for living. He says, وَاحْتِيَاجٍ لِعَجْنٍ وَطَبْخٍ غَيْرَ مَرْقٍ أو غَيْرِ مَرْقٍ. Likewise, if he's in need of the water for preparation of dough or cooking something غَيْرِ مَرْق, other than broth or stew. What does he mean by this? Basically, if it is something which he requires to live. Dough is something which a person can survive upon. It's a basic staple type of food. So if he needs water to cook or to prepare that which he's going to live off, then he can preserve the water and perform tayammum. And maraq, the broth or the stew or anything which is considered a luxury or excessive, it goes beyond that which a person needs, it would not be permissible for him to preserve the water so that he can prepare such a thing. He says, وَفَقْدِ آلَةٍ. Likewise, if a person does not have the utensil needed to extract the water, then he can perform tayammum. So as an example, the example the fuqaha they usually give, if a person is, he has a well or he has come to a well, but there is nothing to extract, there's no bucket, there's no large spoon or whatever is used, then he can perform tayammum. Why? Because he is in the situation of a person really who doesn't have water, as he has no access to the water. Then he says, وَخَوْفِ فَوْتِ صَلَاةِ جَنَازَةٍ أَوْ عِيدٍ. So if a person fears that if they were to go to perform the tahara, the wudu, then or the ghusl, then they would miss salat janazah. And of course, in this situation, it's highly unlikely that a person would need to perform ghusl for the janazah. But whatever the case, a person needs to purify themselves. They can perform the tayammum if they're afraid that they are going to miss the janazah prayer by going to perform the wudu. So as an example, in Medina or in Mecca, if a person were to try to pray the janazah and in between the salah and the janazah prayer they break their wudu, then if they were to go to perform wudu in the bathroom areas, by the time they get back they would miss the janazah prayer. In such a situation, it's permissible for them to perform tayammum. Likewise, Eid, if they were to perform Eid salah, let's say again in Medina or in Mecca or a place where the masjid is very big and the water facilities are quite far away, they fear that if they were to go to perform the wudu, then they would miss the salah. So in that situation they can perform tayammum. But the fuqaha usually they give a condition for this, لِغَيْرِ الْوَلِي. So for other than the person who is responsible for the salah or responsible for the dead person. Sorry. So if a person is the imam and they are responsible for leading the salah, they have to perform the tahara. Why? Because they can delay the salah so that they can perform the tahara. Whereas the average person who is attending, the person who is in attendance of the salah, they do not have the ability to go to the imam and say, Imam, please delay the salah so I can go and perform wudu. So they are permitted to perform the tayammum. Likewise for the relative of the dead person. He says, وَلَيْسَ مِنَ الْعُذْرِ خَوْفُ فَوْتِ الْجُمْعَةِ وَالْوَقْتِ. So he says, in contrast to this, it is not permissible for a person to perform tayammum if they are scared that they are going to miss the Jum'ah prayer or the prayer time is going to leave. So for example, they've woken up and there's just enough time for them to pray the salah, not to perform wudu and pray the salah. If they go to perform wudu and then try to pray the salah, they would miss the salah. In this instance, it's not permissible for them to perform tayammum. They have to go and perform the tahara and then pray the qada. So they have to pray the make-up version of the salah. And the reason for this is because there is a khalaf. There is something which can be prayed in the absence of the Jum'ah and in the absence of performing the prayer in the correct time. For the person who misses the prayer in the correct time, they can make up that prayer outside of its correct time. It's not that a person can do so intentionally, but the space has been given for them to do so when they miss the prayer due to that which is out of their own influence. Likewise, Jum'ah. If a person misses Jum'ah, then they pray the Dhuhr prayer. They can make up or not make up the prayer, but they can pray Dhuhr in the absence of Jum'ah. Therefore, because of the fact that there is something which can be performed in the absence of the initial act of worship, they are not permitted to perform tayammum in order to perform the initial act of worship. They have to go to that which can be performed in its absence. And some of the fuqaha from the madhab, they mention that perhaps it's better that the person performs the tayammum and prays the prayer on time, i.e. the 5 salawats, not the Jum'ah. They perform the tayammum, they pray the salah, and then they go and perform tahara and make the salah up as well. But of course the madhab is that they go and perform the tahara and then they pray the salah as a made up salah rather than praying it on time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from missing our praise. Then he says, Tatimmatun. So now he's going to complete the chapter with Sunan al-Wudu'i wal-Ghusli wal-Tayammum. He's going to mention the Sunan. So what is a Sunnah? Some of the fuqaha, they mention that the Sunnah is that which the Prophet ﷺ would do consistently, but leave off every now and again. And Al-Mulla Ali Qari, rahimahullah ta'ala, in his Fathu Bab al-Inayah, he mentions that some of the Sunnah of the Wudu and the Ghusl, they don't fit into this definition because the Prophet ﷺ performed them continuously, but they would still be considered sunnah. Why? Because they're not mentioned explicitly in the ayah which establishes the integrals. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila salati faghsilu wujuhakum wa aydiyakum, until the end of the ayah. So the fact that they're not mentioned in the ayah, they are to be considered lower than the fard, which would be in the case of the tahara sunnah. So he says yusannu fil wudu'i. He's going to start with the sunan of wudu at tasmiyah. So starting with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And the author, Abdul Ghani al-Ghunaymi rahimahullah, in his commentary on al-Quduri al-Kitab, he says that, and Al-Mulla Ali Qari also mentioned that it's better to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, but it has been mentioned according to the Salaf, Bismillah al-Azim walhamdulillah ala din al-Islam. And some of the scholars, they mentioned to join between the two, but whatever the case, tasmiyah is to mention the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Abdul Ghani al-Ghunaymi rahimahullah, in his commentary on al-Lubab, he says that, or on al-Quduri, sorry, he says that a person can say in the place of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, La ilaha illallah, or Allahu Akbar, something of the sort, as long as it is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's looking at it from the general sense, tasmiyah from the general sense. But it's better to follow the lafz Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Then he says, wa niyyah, likewise, the intention is a sunnah. And this would only come into play when a person has performed that which would consist of the acts of wudu without intending it. So for example, in very hot countries, a person may do everything that they would usually do in wudu for the sake of cooling down. And then salah time starts and they realize they've already performed that which would make up the wudu, so they pray. In the everyday situation, it's not very relevant. So when a person gets up to go and perform wudu, that in and of itself, the getting up is an intention, so they don't really need to worry about that. Then he says, وَغَسْلُ الْيَدَيْنِ إِلَى الرُّسْغَيْنِ ابْتِدَاءً. Likewise, washing the hands up until the wrists to begin with. So this is the sunnah washing of the hand. And some of the fuqaha, they'll mention, إِذَا اسْتَيْقَظَ مِن نَوْمِهِ, if a person wakes up from sleeping, in line with the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, if a person wakes up from his sleep, he should wash his hands thrice before performing the wudu. So this is not actually a condition for washing the hands prior to wudu. Washing the hands prior to wudu, it's a sunnah all of the time, but it's something which is referred to as qayd ittifaqi, where the fuqaha of the madhab, they mention something collectively. And it's in line with the hadith. So wherever a person is performing the wudu, it's sunnah to wash the hands prior to performing the wudu. And if they wake up from their sleep or they think there might be some impurity on their hand, then it becomes, of course, it could be compulsory, and it becomes even more recommended to do so. Then he says, was siwak, so cleaning the mouth with the toothstick, the miswak. If a person doesn't have a miswak, using their finger or using a toothbrush in its place, a person will be rewarded, inshallah, for establishing the sunnah if that's their intention. Then he says, وَالْمَضْمَضَةُ ثَلَاثًا وَلَوْ بِغَرْفَةٍ. So he says washing the mouth, rinsing the mouth 3 times, even if it's with 1 handful of water. So a person would take a handful of water and would take in the water, rinse the mouth, spit it out. Take in the water, rinse the mouth, spit it out. Take in the water, rinse the mouth, spit it out. And the madmada itself is sunnah, according to the madhab. Likewise, doing it 3 times is sunnah. Then he says, وَالْإِسْتِنْشَاقُ بِثَلَاثِ غَرَفَاتٍ. So now performing the istinshaq, so washing and rinsing the inside of the nose. Doing so 3 times. So the istinshaq is sunnah in the wudhu, and the madmada is sunnah in the wudhu. Doing it 3 times is also sunnah. So what here he says, بِثَلَاثِ غَرَفَاتٍ, he says with 3 different handfuls of water. Why? Because when you do when you rinse the nose, the water will start to immediately leave the nose as soon as you sniff it up, and so the water will be contaminated, the water in your hand. So in order to do do it 3 times to establish the sunnah, it's important to use 3 different scoops of water. Then he says, وَتَخْلِيلُ اللِّحْيَةِ الْكَثَّةِ, and rinsing the thick beard, combing the thick beard with water. As for the thin beard, the beard which allows you to see beneath the skin, it's important, and it's considered to be a part of the face, so a person has to wash that area. But that which hangs from a person's face, or that which is very thick, it's sunnah to comb through it, to wash that which is beneath the beard. And there's a slight difference of opinion on this matter within the madhab, but again, for this text, we will stick to that which the author mentions. Then he says, وَالْأَصَابِعِ, the تَخْلِيلُ الْأَصَابِعِ, so basically making sure water is entered in between the fingers, and in between the fingers are rinsed. Now this is only sunnah if a person is certain that in between the fingers has been washed. If a person is uncertain, then this becomes compulsory. It should be done when washing the entire hands, regardless whether a person wants to establish the sunnah or not, so that they don't miss out on washing any part of the body. Then he says, وَتَثْلِيثُ الْغَسْلِ, so the washing thrice, washing each body part 3 times. And he says, وَاسْتِعَابُ الرَّأْسِ بِالْمَسْحِ مَرَّةً, and to wipe over the entire head. And وَمَسْحُ الْأُذُنَيْنِ, likewise wiping over the ears. How would he do this? So if a person wants to wipe over the head and the ears, the sunnah is to wipe over the ears with the same water that is used to wipe over the head. So the way they would do this is they would get the water on their hands, and they would raise the index finger and the thumb, and they would wash, or they would wipe, over the head with the 3 remaining fingers. So they would start from the front of the head, take it all the way back, and then come back again. And they would use the thumbs and the index fingers for the ears. So placing them into the ears and washing the backs and the tops of the ears. That way they are preserving the water. Then he says, وَالدَّلْك, so when a person is washing, to rub the water into the body part. That which is necessary in order for the wudu to be valid is that the water runs over the entire body part, so much so that there is some dripping of the water. So for us it's very easy, running the tap and running the entire body part under. But the dalk should be done regardless. And there's a principle in the madhab, al-khuruju min al-khilafi mustahab, that it is recommended to remove yourself from areas where there is a strong difference of opinion. The issue of dalk, there is a difference of opinion in this issue between the madahib. Some of the fuqaha of the other madahib, they say that it is a part of washing. For your wudu or your ghusl to be valid, there has to be some rubbing of the body part. Therefore, it should be done as a precaution. And he says, with tartib, likewise, doing things in the order mentioned in the ayah. إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ. So following the tartib. Now the other madhahib, some of them they say the tartib is compulsory to be followed, such as the Hanbali madhab. So why is it that the Ahnaf, they don't see the tartib to be compulsory? Because the waw used in the ayah, the waw linguistically, it does not indicate a particular order. For example, if you say دخل المسجد زيد وعمر, when you say that Zayd and Amr entered into the masjid, the waw does not indicate that Zayd entered before Amr. But if you were to say دخل المسجد زيد فعمر, if you would say Zayd entered the masjid and then Amr, the fa there is indicative of a particular order. So the fact that it is a waw, the waw indicates that there is no particular order according to the madhab. And some of the fuqaha of the Ahnaf, they argue that there is an ijma', there is a collective agreement of the fact that the waw indicates no particular order. And of course the other fuqaha from the other madhahib, they would differ with this. But again, precautionarily, the person should follow the tartib in the ayah, and this is only relevant in certain situations. I cannot imagine that a person would perform wudu without following the particular order anyway, and so the order should be followed. But if a person for one reason or another misses out on a particular order, let's say for example they forget to wash one of their arms and they move on to the next part of their wudu, they can go back to the arm and wash it and carry on from where they left off. They don't need to restart the entire wudu. Then he says, وَالْبَدَاءَةُ بِالْمَيَامِنِ, so starting off with the right when washing the arms, the legs, etc., starting with the right. وَرُؤُوسِ الْأَصَابِعِ, likewise starting with the fingertips. So starting from here and making your way up to the elbow and above the elbow. Then he says, وَمُقَدَّمُ الرَّأْسِ, and we already discussed this, so starting from the beginning of the head, وَمَسْحُ الرَّقَبَةِ إِلَى الْحُلْقُومِ, so he says, wiping the nape, and he says, إِلَى الْحُلْقُومِ, so perhaps that's a linguistical error in the book, I mean, because it's not, they don't mention إِلَى الْحُلْقُومِ unless what is meant here is up and until, so perhaps prior to what would be considered as the front part of the neck. But anyway, it's the fuqaha, the ahnaf, they mentioned that wiping the throat area is a bid'ah, it's an innovation. The وَمَسْحُ الرَّقْبَةِ, it's sunnah, and it's the official madhab, likewise the madhab of the Shafi'iyya, and it's a riwayah, it's an opinion attributed to Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, although it's not taken as the official madhab of the Hanbali madhab. Why do I say that? Because some would say this is an innovation to wipe the nape. It's not an innovation, it's mentioned in the sunnah, it's the official madhab of the ahnaf, the Shafi'iyya, it's a riwayah in the Hanbali madhab, and to attribute that which has become an official madhab of the fuqaha of various schools of thought, likewise mentioned in a hadith, even if weak, it's very, very inappropriate to refer to such a thing as innovation. And the earlier scholars of Islam, they would act upon the weak hadith. They wouldn't leave the weak hadith off. They would act upon them. They wouldn't leave them off. Of course, if there is an asl, there is a strong foundation for the action, and that's a discussion to be had in a different lesson, inshallah. But how would a person wipe the nape? So we mentioned the index finger and the thumb would be raised. They would get the water, raise the index finger and thumb, start from the front and go all the way back, and use the water remaining on the thumb and the index finger for the ears, and the water from the back of the hand, they would use it for the nape. So like that, then the ears, and then the nape. And there are ahadith in relation to this, and as we mentioned, it's a strong opinion in the other madhahib as well. So those are the sunan of the wudu. Now he's going to mention the sunan of the ghusl, and then the sunan of the tayammum, and then he's going to go on to how a person would purify their clothing, the body, and the places of worship from what is referred to as al-khabath, so tangible, literal impurities. And we will continue with that inshallah in the next lesson. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين.